There are books that educate, books that comfort, books that echo the prevailing winds of their time. But once in a generation, there emerges a book that does none of these. A book that fractures illusions, that disorients, provokes, and awakens something long buried. A book that feels less like it was written, and more like it was revealed. In the year 1877, such a book was born. Its title, Isis Unveiled. Its author, Helena Petrovna Blavatsky. A woman whose life defied every convention, whose origins were tangled in legend, and whose destiny would rattle the foundations of science, religion, and reason itself. This was not a modest work. It was vast, chaotic, uncompromising. 2 volumes, over the 300 pages, a labyrinth of history, metaphysics, forgotten doctrines, and hidden knowledge. It questioned everything the modern world held sacred, and dared to proclaim that behind the surface of things, another world was waiting to be remembered. From the moment it appeared, Isis Unveiled was surrounded by fire. The scientific establishment called it nonsense. Religious authorities branded it heresy. Yet in private societies behind closed doors, it was studied like scripture. Why? Because the book suggested something radical. That neither science nor religion held the ultimate truth, that both had drifted far from the path, and that scattered across the ruins of ancient civilizations, beneath temples, symbols, and myths, lay the fragments of a primordial wisdom, secret doctrine, older than any known tradition, guarded for centuries and now unveiled. But who was Blavatsky really? A mystic, a charlatan, a messenger? Her followers saw in her the spark of something ancient. Her critics saw danger, deception, delusion, yet none could ignore her presence, and none could ignore the impact of her work. Isis Unveiled did not ask for permission. It did not seek consensus. It emerged like a thunderclap from another time, part philosophical treatise, part magical manifesto, part declaration of war on the complacency of the age. And here, nearly 150 years later, it still refuses to be forgotten. It still challenges, still unsettles, still dares us to look beyond the surface. This is not just the story of a book. It is the story of a reckoning, of a veil lifted, of a hidden current that surged into the world and never fully left. So ask yourself, before we begin, are you prepared to follow that current? Are you ready to question everything you've been told? Because what lies ahead is not history, it is initiation. And it begins with Isis Unveiled. Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, a name that would ignite both devotion and fury in the decades to come. Born in 1831, in the heart of the Russian Empire, she was no ordinary woman. From her earliest years, she defied convention. A daughter of nobility who rejected the comforts of aristocratic life. She was drawn not to society balls or arranged marriages, but to the forbidden. Ancient texts, ghost stories, maps of lost lands, and whispers of forgotten gods. By the time she was 17, she had already escaped the life prescribed to her. Some say she fled her arranged marriage on horseback the very night of her wedding. What followed were 20 years of shadowed travels, years shrouded in rumor, disbelief, and awe. Egypt, Syria, Greece, India, Tibet, the Americas. She claimed to have walked through the ruins of Luxor and meditated in Himalayan caves, to have studied with dervishes in the East and initiated into esoteric orders older than Christianity itself. But it wasn't just geography she traversed. She crossed the thresholds of the seen and unseen. Blavatsky spoke of masters, not metaphorically, but literally. Beings, she said, who watched over humanity from beyond the veil. Guardians of the ancient wisdom, Mahatmas. To the modern mind, these were fantasies. But to those who met her, there was something undeniably otherworldly. A force in her presence, a precision in her words, and a fire in her defiance of everything considered normal or rational in the age of science. When she appeared in New York City in the early 1870s, she was not welcomed. She was noticed. Here was a woman clothed in Eastern robes, smoking like a steamboat, speaking in half a dozen languages, and publicly denouncing both priests and professors alike. She claimed to have seen things no telescope could find. to have heard voices no machine could record, and to have remembered lives no calendar could trace. New York, the rising center of modern thought, didn't know what to make of her. Was she a mystic, a fraud, a genius, a madwoman? But then, in 1877, she struck. With the assistance of Colonel Henry Steele Olcott, a respected lawyer, journalist, and Civil War veteran, she published a work that would forever etch her name into the annals of forbidden knowledge. It was called Isis Unveiled. 2 volumes, each one a labyrinth of ancient history, philosophy, cosmology, and occult doctrine. The first volume bore the subtitle, Science, but this was no tribute to modern science. It was an open challenge, a scathing indictment of what she called the materialist delusion. She accused scientists of dissecting the world, but understanding nothing of its soul, of worshipping mechanisms and dismissing consciousness as a chemical accident. She argued that behind matter was mind, behind energy, intention, and that the ancients, the Egyptians, the Brahmins, the Chaldeans, knew more about the nature of reality than any modern physicist. It was a bold claim, but Blavatsky did not write timidly. She quoted ancient texts no Western scholar had read. She wove together forgotten fragments from Plato, Buddha, Hermes Trismegistus, and the Vedas. She resurrected the names of sages long erased by dogma and empire, but more than that, she accused. She accused science of arrogance, of blind pride masked as objectivity, of amputating the spirit from the study of the universe. And yet, this was only half the battle. Volume 1, The Science, was a sword raised against the illusion of materialism, but it was also a mirror held up to the Western world, asking, what have we lost in our pursuit of progress? Where did we bury the soul? Blavatsky didn't seek to destroy science. She sought to redeem it, to reconnect it with its ancient roots, to remind the world that knowledge without wisdom becomes a poison, that facts without meaning are hollow. And for this, she would be celebrated by seekers and reviled by skeptics. But at that moment, in 1877, something shifted. The release of Isis Unveiled was not just a publication. It was a declaration. A woman, alone, without academic titles, without institutional backing, had dared to challenge the 2 great powers of her time, the cathedral and the laboratory. And whether one believed her or not, her voice could not be silenced. Her ideas could not be dismissed. And the storm had only just begun. To Helena Blavatsky, the science of the 19th century was not a triumph of reason. It was a cathedral built on sand, a proud edifice of instruments and measurements that, in its pursuit of precision, had amputated the mystery of life. She saw a world enthralled by microscopes, telescopes, and mechanical models, but blind to the forces that animate being. Electricity was charted, gravity was measured, but consciousness was dismissed. The soul was declared irrelevant, the sacred obsolete. In Isis Unveiled Volume 1, Blavatsky launched a full-scale assault on this worldview. She did not nibble at its edges. She struck at its very heart. She accused modern science of arrogance, of confusing mechanism with meaning, of reducing life to mere accident, and the human being to a temporary arrangement of atoms. You dissect the body, she wrote, but you know nothing of the force that animates it. And she meant it. She challenged Darwin, not only the man, but the myth that had grown around him. To Blavatsky, evolution was not false, but incomplete. The soul, she argued, does evolve, but it does not arise from matter. It descends, it incarnates, it unfolds its journey through time, space, and form, according to laws far older than natural selection. Where science saw randomness, she saw rhythm. Where it saw chaos, she pointed to order, hidden, silent, but ever present. And above all, she saw intention, a universe not running on blind chance, but guided by unseen intelligences. Blavatsky did not shy away from confrontation. She mocked the smug certainty of the academies. She referred to materialism as a disease of the intellect, a blindness to all that could not be weighed or photographed. She pointed to ancient civilizations, Egyptians, Hindus, Zoroastrians, and asked, How did they speak of life, energy, and the cosmos with such poetic precision, long before modern science had its vocabulary? She claimed that their temples held truths that physics had yet to grasp, that their symbols were not superstition, but encrypted knowledge, that the laws of nature had once been sacred principles, understood not only with the mind, but with the soul. And this, for Blavatsky, was the central failure of her era. Not that science sought to understand the world, but that it believed the world had already been understood. That matter was the final word. That anything beyond the visible was fantasy. That spirit was a relic of primitive minds. She called it spiritual exile, a condition in which humanity had become lost, rooted in intellect but severed from its origin. Blavatsky's writing was volcanic, erudite, sarcastic, prophetic. She accused some scientists of being priests in lab coats, replacing the altar with the microscope, but preserving the same rigidity of dogma. She accused them of worshiping the machine while ignoring the machinist, of studying the effect while denying the cause. She challenged the rising cult of atheism, not by appealing to blind faith, but by invoking ancient wisdom, logic grounded in centuries of metaphysical philosophy, and accounts drawn from traditions long dismissed by the West. In the pages of Isis, she wove together forgotten cosmologies, spiritual principles, and metaphysical structures, and dared to suggest that these might offer a deeper understanding than the sterile formulas of the day. To her readers, it was intoxicating, to her opponents, infuriating. But what few could deny was the depth of her mind. She quoted texts from Sanskrit, Greek, Hebrew, and Chaldean. She moved fluently between cultures, epochs, and disciplines. She unearthed knowledge that had lain buried under centuries of neglect and scorn, and she reassembled it into a coherent vision, a map of reality in which spirit and matter were not enemies, but partners in a cosmic dance. At the core of her vision stood one radical idea: that consciousness is primary, that the material world is the shadow, not the source, that behind every atom, behind every law of physics, is a force both intelligent and sacred. This was not just philosophy, it was revolution, because it reversed the very structure of modern thought. In the materialist model, spirit is the ghost of matter. In Blavatsky's model, matter is the echo of spirit. And for those who dared to follow her reasoning, the implications were profound. What if science had taken a wrong turn? What if the exclusion of spirit had led to a dead end? What if consciousness is not an anomaly, but the key? Isis Unveiled volume. I wasn't an academic rebuttal. It was a declaration of spiritual insurgency. It announced that the ancient mysteries were not dead, only forgotten, and that the time had come to remember. Blavatsky believed the world was at a crossroads: continue down the path of soulless progress, or awaken to the deeper currents beneath reality. Her critics laughed, her followers listened. And as the ink dried on the first volume of Isis, one thing became clear: science was no longer alone at the table. A new voice had entered the debate, a voice that spoke of forces science could not measure, but that humanity could no longer afford to ignore. But if science, in Blavatsky's eyes, had gone blind, then religion, she believed, had gone deaf. Deaf to its origins, deaf to the voice of spirit it once claimed to serve, and worse, corrupted by power. To her, organized religion was no longer a vehicle for truth, but a prison. A structure once born from divine revelation, now entangled in politics, hierarchy, and control. She accused the church, especially the Christian church, of distorting the ancient teachings it had inherited, of severing sacred truths from their roots, of erasing symbols it no longer understood, and replacing knowledge with doctrine, mysticism with obedience, freedom with fear. Blavatsky argued that Christianity, in its earliest forms, was never meant to be dogmatic, that the figure of Christ was not just a historical man, but the embodiment of a timeless principle, a spiritual archetype present in many ancient traditions. She claimed that what we now call Christianity was once a mystery school, an initiatic path hidden within parables and symbols. But over time, that path was buried. The keys were lost, and in their place came literalism, a rigid interpretation of scriptures that reduced profound metaphysical truths to rules, sins, and punishments. She wrote, "The church took the shell and cast away the kernel. The outer form remained, but the inner fire was extinguished." And yet Blavatsky's message was not anti-Christian. It was deeper than that. She believed in the spiritual core behind all religions, Christianity included. But she saw clearly how that core had been hidden, twisted, diluted across centuries. To her, religion was not the enemy of truth. It had simply forgotten its own origin. Isis Unveiled speaks of a universal doctrine, a hidden current of wisdom that flows beneath all sacred traditions. She called it the ancient wisdom, and she argued that long before Christianity, Islam, or Judaism ever appeared, this primordial doctrine was known across the world. In Egypt, it was taught in the temples. In India, it echoed in the Vedas. In Chaldea, it was passed down by priests of the stars. And even in the Americas, it survived in the rituals of forgotten civilizations. This was not syncretism. It was synthesis. Not the blending of different religions, but the rediscovery of their common root. All religions, she wrote, are branches of the same archaic tree. A single truth expressed through many tongues. A central flame scattered into 1,000 lanterns. To some, this was heresy. To others, revelation. Blavatsky challenged the very foundation of religious authority. She argued that no church, no priest, no book could claim a monopoly on truth. That spiritual knowledge is not bestowed by hierarchy, but earned through inner transformation. She exposed how sacred symbols, the cross, the serpent, the chalice, the Trinity, were all far older than their current religious associations. That the Christian sacraments had echoes in the Eleusinian mysteries, the rites of Isis and Osiris, and the sacred ceremonies of ancient Asia. She claimed the Bible itself was a book of esoteric codes, a symbolic narrative containing layers of meaning, cosmological, moral, initiatic. But the clergy had forgotten how to read it. Instead, they preached fear, damnation, guilt, a God of wrath instead of a universe of law and harmony. Blavatsky believed that the divine was not something to be worshipped blindly, but understood through wisdom, not feared, but realized. She saw true religion as a science of the soul, a sacred psychology that taught human beings how to evolve, how to awaken, how to remember who and what they truly are. And she warned that without this deeper understanding, religion becomes a tool of control, a mechanism not of liberation, but of servitude. In Isis Unveiled, she writes, "Dogma is the coffin of spiritual truth, and she had come, not to attack faith, but to exhume what had been buried within it." Her message was not merely critical, it was hopeful, that beyond the ruins of orthodoxy, the original wisdom could still be found. Ancient texts, in forgotten temples, in the silence of meditation, in the inner chambers of the soul. To the religious authorities of her time, this was dangerous. She was called a blasphemer, a deceiver. She was accused of undermining faith, of leading the faithful into confusion. But to her followers, she was a revealer, a woman who had dared to say that truth was not owned, it was universal, and that each soul had the right and the responsibility to seek it directly. Blavatsky's confrontation with religion was not simply intellectual, it was spiritual. It was a call to awaken the inner temple, to stop kneeling before dead words and begin listening to the living silence within. Religion, she believed, could either be a guardian, a protector of sacred wisdom, or a prison, shutting out the very light it once sought to serve. And the choice, as always, was ours. At the heart of Isis Unveiled lies a thesis both shocking and sublime, that long before the rise of modern civilization, before Christianity, before Greece, before even Egypt, there existed a wisdom tradition so vast, so ancient, so complete, that all religions and philosophies are but its fragments. This, Blavatsky declared, was Theosophy, not a creed, not a belief system, but the divine wisdom, a universal doctrine that once united humanity across the globe, a sacred science known to the sages of antiquity and preserved in secret by those who refused to let the flame die. She did not invent this idea. She claimed to remember it, to have studied it among those who still guarded its keys, in caves, temples, and monastic retreats hidden far from the noise of the modern world. According to Blavatsky, this ancient wisdom taught that the universe is alive, that all forms, all energies, all beings, seen and unseen, are interconnected, that behind the veil of matter lies a spiritual architecture, governed by laws more elegant than anything found in the textbooks of her day. She spoke of consciousness not as a byproduct of the brain, but as the very fabric of existence, the ocean in which all things swim. She wrote of energy that precedes form, of cycles that govern the rise and fall of civilizations, souls, and stars, of spiritual evolution, a path not of salvation through belief, but of awakening through knowledge, discipline, and inner transformation. And she hinted at something deeper still, that humanity itself is far older than we are told, that civilizations now considered mythical, Atlantis, Lemuria, were real epochs of human history, epochs where the ancient wisdom was not only known, but lived. To the modern reader, these claims may sound outrageous, but Blavatsky did not write as a theorist. She wrote as a witness. She described a golden thread woven through the ages, a transmission of knowledge passed from initiate to initiate, surviving war, cataclysm, and cultural decay. She said it appeared in the temples of Egypt, in the Vedic hymns of India, in the oracles of Delphi, in the druidic groves, and even in the secret symbols of medieval alchemists. This, she insisted, was no coincidence. It was evidence of a shared origin, a central spiritual source from which all authentic teachings emerge. Beneath the exoteric forms, the rituals, myths, saints, and gods, lies an esoteric core, a science of spirit, a metaphysics of the soul, one that describes the laws of karma, the cycles of reincarnation, the subtle anatomy of the human being, and the journey of consciousness through countless lives on its return to the divine. Blavatsky argued that the East had preserved this knowledge more faithfully. In the teachings of the yogis, the Buddhists, the Vedantins, she found echoes of the original doctrine. And it was in the East, she claimed, that the guardians of this wisdom, the Mahatmas, still watched over humanity's spiritual destiny. But the West, too, had its fragments. In the Hermetic writings, the Gnostic Gospels, the Kabbalah, and the Rosicrucian manuscripts, scattered pieces of the puzzle remained, all waiting to be remembered, reassembled. In Isis Unveiled, she attempted just that, to trace the outlines of this hidden tradition, to show how the ancient truths had been broken apart, misinterpreted, persecuted, and how they might yet be restored. For her, this was not nostalgia, it was prophecy. She believed the modern world stood at a spiritual crossroads. One path led to deeper materialism, to mechanized minds and soulless systems. The other led back, not backwards but inward, toward the sacred science that once illumined the temples of Atlantis and still lived in the heart of every seeking soul. And so she offered Isis Unveiled not as a conclusion, but as a beginning, a key, a gateway, an invitation to remember what had been lost, to see beyond dogma, beyond appearances, beyond the temporary structures of belief, and rediscover a wisdom older than time. It was, she wrote, a voice from the night of ages, from Atlantis, echoing in the age of steam. And those who heard it, truly heard it, were never quite the same again. The response, volcanic. Isis Unveiled did not land quietly. It crashed into the intellectual world of the 19th century like a meteor, and in its wake, nothing remained untouched. Scientists scoffed, philosophers sneered, religious leaders raged, newspapers called her dangerous, delusional, sometimes both. She was accused of plagiarism, of fabrication, of madness. A woman with no academic training, no university affiliation, who dared to challenge the great institutions of science and faith. It was unthinkable. And yet, her words spread like wildfire. Thousands of copies of Isis Unveiled were sold within months. It was read in salons, in spiritualist circles, in secret societies. It was debated in journals and dissected in drawing rooms. For every critic who dismissed it as incoherent mysticism, there were readers who found within its chaotic brilliance a voice that echoed something ancient, something long forgotten but strangely familiar. Blavatsky had done what few before her dared to attempt. She had built a bridge between the mystic and the modern, between the East and the West, between reason and revelation. And whether they believed her or not, no one could deny the force of her presence. She did not merely write, she thundered. Some called her a fraud, a clever manipulator with a flair for the exotic. They pointed to inconsistencies, to contradictions, to unverifiable claims. They questioned the existence of her so-called masters, the mysterious Mahatmas who, she said, guided her work from behind the scenes. They accused her of fabrication, of theatrical mysticism, of weaving fantasy into philosophy. But others saw something else. They saw a woman who had defied every norm, a woman who had tapped into sources of knowledge that academic minds could not explain, a woman who spoke with the certainty of one who had seen. To her critics, she was an imposter. To her admirers, she was a revealer, a prophetess, a messenger of the hidden brotherhood. And in time, her following began to grow, not among the comfortable elites, but among the seekers, those who felt deep down that the world offered more than what they'd been taught, those who sensed that the official stories of science, of religion, of history were incomplete. Isis Unveiled became a spark, a rallying point for a new kind of spiritual inquiry, one that rejected blind belief, but also refused to kneel before cold materialism. Blavatsky did not offer salvation. She offered a challenge to look deeper, to unlearn, to remember. And this, perhaps, is why she stirred such fury. She did not merely criticize institutions, she exposed their fragility. She forced her readers to confront the possibility that the world they knew was built on partial truths, on buried traditions, on the deliberate forgetting of something vast and sacred. The backlash was fierce. Religious journals condemned her as an agent of Satan. Scientific publications mocked her as a charlatan and a mystic crank. Even spiritualist communities, some of which had welcomed her, grew uneasy with her growing influence, with her insistence on the supremacy of Eastern wisdom over Western seances and parlor tricks. But Blavatsky was not moved. She had never sought approval. She had come to reveal. And in her eyes, the firestorm around her was not proof of failure, but of success. To the blind, she said, truth appears as darkness. And she embraced that darkness, becoming a lightning rod for both praise and damnation. What Isis Unveiled made clear was this: there would be no return to silence. The ancient wisdom had been spoken aloud. The veil had been pierced. And the modern world would never again be able to claim ignorance of the deeper mysteries. For her admirers, Isis was the first trumpet in a new age of spiritual awakening. For her enemies, it was a dangerous deviation, a book that threatened to unravel centuries of theological and scientific consensus. But one thing was certain: Blavatsky could no longer be ignored. She had entered the arena not as a guest, but as a force, and love her or hate her, the world had to reckon with what she had unleashed. Because Isis Unveiled was not merely a book, it was a flame, and those who touched it never emerged unchanged. More than a century has passed since Isis Unveiled first appeared. The empires that ruled when it was written have crumbled. The sciences Blavatsky criticized have evolved, expanded, and fractured into ever more complex forms. Religions have shifted. Wars have redrawn maps. Technology has reached into the fabric of the atom and the void of space. And yet, the questions she posed still burn. What is consciousness? What is life? Is the soul an illusion, or the very ground of being? What if the boundary between science and spirit was never meant to divide, but to reveal two perspectives of the same infinite reality? What if matter is but condensed energy, and energy a manifestation of intention, and intention the echo of a higher intelligence that speaks not in words, but in symbols, dreams, and silence? Blavatsky dared to ask. But more than that, she dared to answer. And in doing so, she lit a flame. Not a comfortable light, but a disruptive one. a flame that has refused to be extinguished. To the academic world, her name still stirs discomfort. To the religious world, she remains a ghost in the archives, a voice both inconvenient and unerasable. But to seekers, to wanderers between worlds, to those who feel the pulse of the invisible beneath the surface of things, she remains a guide, not infallible, not unquestionable, but fearless. A woman who stepped outside the lines drawn by centuries of dogma and carved a path through the unknown. Isis Unveiled is not an easy book. It does not flatter the reader. It does not offer easy answers or clear categories. It meanders, it confronts, it demands. But perhaps that was the point, to shake the reader awake, to pierce the surface of accepted truth and reveal something more primal, more ancient, more human than any system could contain. Its purpose was never to conclude. It was to ignite. And that flame still flickers, in the quiet rebellion of the one who questions the official story, in the eyes of the solitary reader who searches for meaning beyond dogma, in the trembling certainty that the world is far more mysterious than we are ever taught to believe. Blavatsky reminded us that we are not mere accidents of matter, not cogs in a blind machine, not sinners groveling before a wrathful God. We are souls in evolution, pilgrims of the infinite, echoes of a forgotten divinity, learning to remember. She did not ask us to believe her. She asked us to think, to study, to question, to look inward and backward and beyond. Because what if truth was buried, not by accident but by design? What if the amnesia of the modern world was no mere consequence of progress, but the result of a deliberate severing, a forgetting of our roots, a silencing of the sacred? In Isis Unveiled, Blavatsky pulls back the curtain, just enough to let the light through. She does not reveal the entire mystery. She couldn't. But she reminds us that the mystery exists, and that it is not found in temples, nor in laboratories, nor even in books. It is found in the heart of the seeker. That flame she carried, it still lives, in every question that refuses to die, in every mind that hungers for more, in every soul that dares to say, there is something deeper, something ancient, something real. So, as we close this chapter, ask yourself, are you content with the surface of things, or are you ready to descend beneath it? Are you satisfied with what the world has told you? Or do you sense perhaps that much of what we call truth is merely the tip of the iceberg? Blavatsky's gift was not certainty. It was a challenge. To live with eyes open, to seek the unseen, to walk the razor's edge between reason and revelation, to remember that the world, beneath its noise and spectacle, still hides its secrets in plain sight. Isis Unveiled remains, not as a relic, not as a monument, but as a living flame, and it calls to those who are not afraid, to doubt, to wonder, to awaken. The veil has been lifted, the path is open, and the mystery is alive.